Imagine biting into food so delicious that ancient emperors hoarded the currency used to buy it, and warriors risked their lives crossing enemy territories just to taste what commoners ate every single day on the streets. The Aztec marketplace wasn't just a place to shop. It was a sensory explosion where the smell of roasting corn mixed with exotic spices you've never heard of, where vendors shouted over each other in Nahuatl, and where a single cacao bean, smaller than your thumbnail, could buy you a meal that would make your taste buds dance in ways modern street food can't even touch. We're talking about an empire that built floating gardens on lakes, constructed pyramids that still stand today, and created a food culture so advanced that chocolate, tomatoes, avocados, vanilla, and chili peppers all came from their kitchens. But here's what nobody tells you about the Aztecs. While European peasants were eating bland porridge and stale bread, Aztec commoners were walking through markets that looked like food festivals, buying gourmet street snacks with beans that literally grew on trees. The currency itself was edible. Think about that for a second. Your money could be made into the richest, most divine drink known to humanity, or you could spend it on 30 different kinds of tamales, each one wrapped in a different leaf and stuffed with ingredients that would cost a fortune today. Let me take you back to Tenochtitlan in the early 16th century, before Spanish conquistadors arrived and changed everything forever. The sun rises over the massive lake city, and you're standing at the edge of Tlatelolco, the largest marketplace in all of Mesoamerica. We're not talking about some small village market here. This place was absolutely enormous. Spanish conquistadors, who saw it with their own eyes, said it was bigger than any market in Europe, including those in Seville and Rome. Over 60,000 people visited this market every single day, and on special market days, that number could double. The plaza was so huge that it would take you hours just to walk through all the different sections. The air hits you first. Smoke from hundreds of cooking fires mixing with the sweet smell of vanilla, the sharp bite of chili peppers roasting over hot coals, the earthy scent of corn being ground on stone metates, and underneath it all, the rich, almost indescribable aroma of cacao beans being prepared for drinking chocolate. Your stomach would be growling before you even reach the food section, because the Aztecs understood something that modern food scientists are only now proving. Smell accounts for about 80% of what we think of as taste, and these vendors knew exactly how to manipulate your senses to make you buy their food. Now let's talk about that cacao bean in your hand. This wasn't just currency. This was sacred. The Aztecs believed cacao beans were gifts from Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who brought knowledge and culture to humanity. The beans were so valuable that people counterfeited them by emptying out the shells and filling them with dirt or avocado pits. You had to be careful because getting stuck with fake cacao beans could ruin your whole day at the market. But a real cacao bean, authenticated and fresh, was your ticket to an incredible eating experience. Let's start with the most democratic food in the Aztec Empire, something that absolutely everyone ate, regardless of social class. Tortillas. But forget everything you think you know about tortillas, because what the Aztec street vendors sold was on a completely different level. These weren't the thin, pale discs you buy at the grocery store. Aztec tortillas came in dozens of varieties, each one made fresh right in front of you by women who had been perfecting their technique since childhood. The most basic tortilla, called a tlaxcali, cost practically nothing, maybe half a cacao bean if you bought several at once. But even the basic version was spectacular because of the way they made it. The vendor would take dried corn kernels and cook them in water mixed with limestone in a process called nixtamalization. this wasn't just some random cooking method. This chemical process actually changes the corn at a molecular level, making the nutrients more available to your body and creating that distinctive flavor and aroma that makes real corn tortillas smell like heaven. After soaking overnight, the corn turned into something called nixtamal, which was then ground by hand on a volcanic stone metate. The grinding alone could take an hour for a large batch, and you could hear the rhythmic sound of stone on stone echoing through the market as dozens of vendors prepared their masa. The masa, or corn dough, was patted out by hand into perfect circles. And here's something that would blow your mind if you watched it happen. These women could shape a tortilla in about 3 seconds flat, slapping the dough between their palms so fast your eyes could barely follow the movement. Then it went straight onto a hot comal, a flat ceramic griddle that had been heating over a fire for hours. The tortilla would puff up with steam, getting those characteristic brown spots, and the smell that came off that comal was intoxicating. Fresh, earthy, slightly sweet, with a hint of smokiness from the fire. One cacao bean could buy you about 3 or 4 basic tortillas, depending on the size and the vendor. But the Aztecs didn't just eat plain tortillas. That would be like buying bread and eating it with nothing on it. The vendors offered countless varieties with different additions mixed right into the masa. There were red tortillas colored with chili, black ones made with ash from burned corn husks, yellow ones with extra ground pumpkin seeds, and even blue tortillas made from a special variety of corn that still exists today in Mexico. Each color wasn't just for show. Each one had a slightly different flavor and texture, and regular customers had their favorites. But here's where it gets really interesting. For one cacao bean, you could get a basic tortilla and have it filled with something simple but delicious right there on the spot. The most popular filling, the one that every single street vendor offered, was beans. But again, forget what you think you know about beans, because Aztec beans were in a completely different category. They grew dozens of varieties, each with distinct flavors, from the creamy pale beans called ayocatl to the smaller, earthier black beans that are still popular in Mexico today. The vendor would have a massive clay pot of beans that had been cooking since before dawn, seasoned with epazote, an herb that has a flavor somewhere between oregano and cilantro, with a slight petroleum taste that sounds weird, but works incredibly well with beans. The beans weren't just boiled. They were cooked until they were creamy and rich, then mashed slightly so they had this perfect texture, not quite refried but not whole either. The vendor would slap a hot tortilla on a piece of bark paper, spoon on a generous portion of beans, maybe add a sprinkle of ground pumpkin seeds for richness, and fold it over. That simple bean taco was a complete meal, packed with protein and complex carbohydrates, and it cost 1 cacao bean. Now, if you wanted to upgrade a bit, you could add salsa, and Aztec salsas were absolutely incredible. The vendors had clay bowls filled with different types, and each one was made fresh every morning. The most basic was a simple salsa verde made from tomatillos, those small green fruits that look like tomatoes wearing paper husks. The vendor would roast the tomatillos over the fire until the skin blistered and blackened, then grind them with chilies and cilantro on the metate. The result was bright, acidic, spicy, and absolutely addictive. But if you wanted something with more kick, there was salsa made from chilies that would make your eyes water from 3 feet away. The Aztecs cultivated dozens of chili varieties, and they understood the heat level of each one, like a scientist understands chemical compounds. There were mild chilies like the poblano, medium ones like the jalapeno, and absolute monsters like the chile de árbol that could set your mouth on fire. And here's something fascinating. The Aztecs knew that you could control the heat level by including or removing the seeds and veins, and they used this knowledge to create salsas of precisely calibrated spiciness. For special occasions, vendors made salsa from smoked chilies mixed with chocolate. Yes, chocolate in your salsa. This wasn't sweet. This was deep, complex, earthy, with the richness of chocolate balancing the heat of the chilies and the acid of the tomatillos. This type of salsa was the ancestor of mole, and just a spoonful would transform your simple bean taco into something extraordinary. A dollop of this special salsa might cost you an extra cacao bean, but it was worth it. Let's move on to something that would cost you exactly one cacao bean and would give you a completely different experience. Tamales. If tortillas were the bread of the Aztec world, tamales were the sandwiches, the complete meals wrapped up in neat, portable packages that you could buy from a vendor and eat while walking through the market. But calling them sandwiches doesn't do them justice because Aztec tamales were culinary masterpieces. The basic process of making a tamale hasn't changed much in 500 years. You take masa and spread it on a wrapper, usually a corn husk, but sometimes banana leaves or other plant materials. Then you add filling, wrap it up, and steam it until everything melds together into a perfect package. But the Aztecs elevated this simple concept into an art form. They made tamales in dozens, maybe hundreds, of varieties, and each region had its specialties. For one cacao bean, you could buy a basic tamal from a street vendor. The most common type was filled with beans and chilies, wrapped in corn husks, and steamed until the masa became fluffy and tender. But even this basic version was delicious because the masa was often mixed with a bit of melted fat, usually from a bird, or sometimes from crushed pumpkin seeds, which made it rich and moist instead of dry and crumbly. When you unwrapped the hot tamal, steam would escape carrying the aroma of corn, chilies, and spices. The variety of tamales available in the market was staggering. There were sweet tamales made with honey and crushed amaranth seeds. There were tamales stuffed with mushrooms that had been gathered in the mountains. There were tamales filled with tiny fish from the lake, mixed with herbs and wrapped in special water plant leaves that added their own flavor. There were tamales made with blue corn that had a slightly nuttier taste. There were tamales that included spirulina, those microscopic algae that grew in the lake and were harvested, dried, and added to food for extra nutrition and a unique flavor. Some tamales were luxury items that cost many cacao beans, stuffed with turkey meat or venison, but the basic varieties were absolutely within reach for regular people. A working-class Aztec could buy a tamal for breakfast with one cacao bean, eat it on the way to work, and have a satisfying meal that would keep them going for hours. The vendors who specialized in tamales were usually women, and they had massive pots of water boiling over fires, with dozens of tamales steaming away in layers. The sound of bubbling water and the sight of steam rising from those pots was a constant presence in the market. Here's something that might surprise you. The Aztecs ate insects, and not because they were starving or desperate. They ate insects because they were delicious, nutritious, and in some cases, considered delicacies, and you could buy insect-based street food for very reasonable prices, often just 1 or 2 cacao beans for a generous portion. The most popular insects were grasshoppers, called chapulines in Nahuatl. These weren't the big, tough grasshoppers you might see in your garden. These were collected at a specific stage in their life cycle, when they were tender and flavorful. The vendors would roast them on a comal with chili powder, salt from the lake, and sometimes crushed garlic or lime. The result was crunchy, salty, spicy, with a nutty flavor that was surprisingly addictive. A small cup of roasted grasshoppers cost about 1 cacao bean, and they were packed with protein. But grasshoppers weren't the only insect delicacy. There were ant larvae called Eskimoles, which were harvested from the roots of agave plants. These looked like white rice grains and had a buttery, nutty flavor that made them incredibly popular. They were more expensive than grasshoppers, maybe 2 or 3 cacao beans for a small portion, but still affordable for a special treat. Vendors would sauté them with chilies and herbs and serve them in a tortilla, or just in a small clay bowl with a tortilla on the side for scooping. There were also aguacate worms, actually the larvae of a moth that lived in agave plants, which were considered such a delicacy that they're still expensive in modern Mexico. These had a smoky, intense flavor and were often dried and ground into a powder that could be sprinkled on other foods. And perhaps most surprisingly, there were waterfly eggs called ahuautle, harvested from the surface of the lake. These tiny eggs were gathered, dried, and pressed into cakes that could be cooked like patties. They had a flavor similar to caviar, slightly fishy, but in a good way, and they were another complete protein source. The fact that insects were regular street food tells us something important about Aztec culture. They weren't squeamish or limited in their food choices. They looked at the natural world around them and saw opportunities for delicious food everywhere. And from a nutritional standpoint, they were absolutely right. Insects are some of the most efficient protein sources on the planet, and the Aztecs had figured this out centuries before modern nutritionists started talking about sustainable food sources. Now let's talk about something that would cost you 1 cacao bean and would give you an experience that's almost impossible to find today. Atole. This was a hot drink made from masa dissolved in water, flavored with various additions, and served steaming hot in clay cups by vendors throughout the market. Atole was the coffee of the Aztec world, the warm drink that people consumed in the morning or on cool evenings, the comfort food that everyone grew up drinking. The basic atole was simple. Take masa, dissolve it in water, heat it up while stirring constantly until it thickens slightly, and you have a warm, filling drink that tastes like liquid corn tortilla. It sounds plain, but it was actually delicious, especially when served fresh and hot. The consistency was somewhere between a thin soup and a thick drink, substantial enough to be filling but liquid enough to drink from a cup. 1 cacao bean would buy you a generous cup of basic atole, enough to warm you up and take the edge off your hunger. But the vendors offered countless variations. There was atole flavored with chocolate, which was thick, rich, and absolutely divine. There was atole made with chilies, which sounds strange but was warming and energizing. There was pineapple atole, strawberry atole, and atole flavored with sapote, a sweet tropical fruit that tasted like a mixture of chocolate, caramel, and sweet potato. Each variety had its devoted fans, and people would walk across the market to buy from their favorite atole vendor. Some versions of atole included crushed amaranth seeds, called huatli, which added a nutty flavor and made the drink even more nutritious. Amaranth was incredibly important to the Aztecs, almost as important as corn and beans. They used it in religious ceremonies, made it into bread, and added it to drinks like atole. The seeds are tiny, smaller than quinoa, but they're packed with protein and have a distinctive, pleasant flavor. The atole vendors had special clay pots that were wide and shallow, perfect for stirring the drink as it heated. They used wooden stirrers called molinillos, carved with ridges and patterns, and the constant stirring motion created a slight foam on top of the atole that was considered the mark of a well-made drink. On cool mornings, the steam rising from the Atole pots created a mist in the market, and the smell of corn and spices mixed with the smoke from the fires. Let's talk about something that might cost you 1 or 2 cacao beans and would blow your mind with its sophistication. Sauces made from pumpkin seeds. The Aztecs grew pumpkins and squash in their floating gardens, and they used every part of the plant. The flesh was cooked and eaten, the flowers were treated as a delicacy, and the seeds were dried, roasted, and ground into incredibly versatile ingredients. Street food vendors made sauces from ground pumpkin seeds that ranged from simple to complex. The most basic version, called pepita sauce, was made by toasting pumpkin seeds until they popped and released their oils, then grinding them with water until they formed a paste. This paste was mixed with chilies and herbs to create a sauce that was nutty, rich, slightly bitter, and absolutely delicious. It cost about 1 cacao bean for a small bowl, and you could use it to dip your tortillas or pour it over beans or vegetables. More elaborate versions included tomatillos, cilantro, and multiple types of chilies, creating sauces that were bright green, intensely flavored, and complex. Some vendors made their sauces with roasted seeds, others with raw seeds, and each method produced a distinctly different flavor. The roasted seed sauces were deeper and nuttier, while the raw seed sauces were lighter and more herbaceous. Here's something amazing. These pumpkin seed sauces are the direct ancestors of pipián, a sauce that's still made in Mexico today and is considered one of the great achievements of Mexican cuisine. But the Aztec street vendors were making it 500 years ago and selling it for the equivalent of pocket change. They had figured out how to create umami-rich, nutritionally complete sauces using only plant ingredients, long before anyone knew what umami was or why certain combinations of ingredients tasted so incredibly satisfying. Now let's get to something that would cost you exactly 1 cacao bean and would give you a taste that's almost impossible to replicate today. Algae cakes from Lake Texcoco. Yes, you read that right. Algae. The lake that surrounded Tenochtitlan was filled with spirulina, a type of blue-green algae that's now sold as an expensive superfood supplement. But the Aztecs were harvesting it, processing it, and eating it as regular food centuries ago. The algae harvesters would skim the surface of the lake with fine mesh nets, collecting the spirulina that formed thick mats on the water. They would bring this to shore, spread it out to dry in the sun, and then press it into cakes that looked something like dark green cheese. These cakes could be stored for long periods, making them an important food source, especially for people who couldn't afford meat. Street vendors sold these algae cakes either whole or crumbled into tortillas or mixed into other dishes. The flavor was intense, earthy, slightly fishy, but not in an unpleasant way, and incredibly savory. One algae cake cost about 1 cacao bean and provided an enormous amount of protein and nutrients. In fact, spirulina is one of the most nutritionally dense foods on the planet, containing more protein per weight than beef, along with vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. The Aztecs often ate the algae cakes with chili sauce or wrapped them in tortillas with beans. The combination of the intense umami flavor of the spirulina with the heat of chilies and the earthiness of beans created something that was far greater than the sum of its parts. It's one of those flavor combinations that seems weird on paper, but makes perfect sense when you taste it. Spanish conquistadors wrote about these algae cakes with a mixture of disgust and fascination. They couldn't believe that the Aztecs were eating what looked like mud from the lake. But the joke was on the Spanish because they were eating their bland bread and salted meat, while the Aztecs were consuming one of the healthiest foods known to humanity. Modern science has confirmed that the Aztec diet, with its combination of corn, beans, squash, chilies, and spirulina, was extraordinarily well-balanced and nutritionally complete. Let's move to something sweeter now, something that would cost you 1 or 2 cacao beans and would satisfy your craving for dessert. The Aztecs loved sweets, and their street vendors offered numerous options. The most accessible sweet treat was fruit, which grew in abundance in the warm climate around the lake. For 1 cacao bean, you could buy a huge portion of fresh fruit from vendors who had stalls overflowing with colorful produce. There were papayas, cut open to reveal their orange flesh and black seeds. There were pineapples, sweet and acidic and incredibly refreshing in the heat. There were cherimoyas, a fruit that Mark Twain would later call the most delicious fruit known to men, with flesh that tasted like a mixture of pineapple, banana, and strawberry. There were countless varieties of avocados, from small ones the size of limes to massive fruits as big as your head. But here's where Aztec fruit vendors got creative. They didn't just sell plain fruit. They had countless ways of preparing and serving it that turned simple fruit into something special. They made fruit salads mixed with chili powder, lime, and salt, creating the perfect combination of sweet, spicy, salty, and sour. This flavor combination might sound weird if you've never tried it, but it's absolutely addictive, and it's still incredibly popular in Mexico today. The chili powder enhances the sweetness of the fruit, the lime adds acidity and freshness, and the salt brings everything together. They also sold dried fruit, which was made by laying slices out in the sun until they became chewy and concentrated in flavor. Dried mango was especially popular, sweet and tangy and easy to carry around. Dried pineapple was intensely sweet and fibrous, and they made fruit leathers by pounding fruit into a paste, spreading it thin, and drying it until it became flexible sheets that you could roll up and eat like candy. Then there were treats made with honey and amaranth. The vendors would pop amaranth seeds like popcorn, mix them with honey or agave syrup, and form them into bars or balls. These were called alegría, which means happiness, and they were the candy bars of the Aztec world. Crunchy, sweet, nutty, and satisfying, they provided quick energy and tasted amazing. 1 or 2 cacao beans would buy you several pieces of alegría, enough to share with friends or save for later. The honey itself was a luxury because the Aztecs didn't have the same honeybees that Europeans did. They kept stingless bees that produced smaller amounts of honey, which made it more valuable. But they also used agave syrup, which they made by harvesting the sap from agave plants and boiling it down until it concentrated into a thick, sweet syrup. This agave syrup was cheaper than honey and was used in all sorts of street food, from sweetening atole to making candy. Now, we need to talk about something that's absolutely mind-blowing. For just a couple of cacao beans, you could buy an incredibly sophisticated dish that would take hours to make at home. We're talking about mole, or at least the early versions of it. The word mole comes from the Nahuatl word mole, which just means sauce, but it came to represent these incredibly complex sauces that contained dozens of ingredients and required hours of preparation. Street vendors who specialized in mole would start preparing their sauce before dawn, roasting chilies over an open fire until they were charred and smoky. They would toast spices like cinnamon and cloves that had been traded from far away. They would grind pumpkin seeds and sesame seeds into powder. They would add tomatoes, tomatillos, and sometimes even cacao to create depth. Each vendor had their own secret recipe, passed down through generations, and customers could taste the difference. For 1 or 2 cacao beans, a vendor would give you a generous serving of mole over a tortilla or mixed with beans. The mole itself was dark, almost black, with a flavor so complex that your taste buds would struggle to identify all the different components. There was heat from the chilies, but it was balanced by sweetness. There was earthiness from the seeds and nuts, but it was brightened by tomatoes and herbs. There was smokiness from the roasted ingredients, but it was rounded out by spices. Every spoonful was different, revealing new flavors and combinations. Making mole at home was possible, but incredibly time-consuming. You had to source all the ingredients, which might require visiting multiple different sections of the market. You had to roast and grind everything separately. You had to cook it for hours, stirring constantly to prevent burning. Most people preferred to buy it from the specialists, who did nothing but make mole, perfecting their technique over years of practice. Here's something that would blow your mind and only cost you 2 or 3 cacao beans. Whole fried fish from the lake, served hot and crispy with salsa and tortillas. Lake Texcoco and the surrounding lakes were full of fish, including small whitefish that were perfect for frying whole. The Aztecs didn't have access to the same type of cooking oil we use today, but they had rendered fat from waterfowl, and they had oil from various seeds. The fish vendors would have fires going with clay pans full of hot oil. They'd take fresh fish, season them with salt and chilies, and fry them until the skin was crispy and the flesh was tender. The whole fish would be served on a piece of bark paper or a large leaf, with hot tortillas on the side and bowls of different salsas. You'd eat it with your hands, pulling off pieces of crispy skin and tender flesh, wrapping them in tortillas with salsa. The variety of fish available was staggering. There were several species that lived only in those lakes and are now extinct or nearly extinct because the lakes have been mostly drained. The Spanish conquistadors wrote about seeing fish markets with dozens of different species, from tiny fingerlings that were fried and eaten like French fries to larger fish that were meaty and substantial. One particularly interesting type was the axolotl, those strange salamanders with external gills that look like they're smiling. Yes, the Aztecs ate them. They were considered a delicacy, and they tasted something like a cross between fish and chicken. They were usually cooked in stews or tamales rather than fried, and they cost more than regular fish, maybe 5 or 6 cacao beans for one axolotl, but they were available, and people who wanted to try something special would buy them. Let's talk about something that was incredibly common and incredibly versatile: squash blossoms. The Aztecs grew squash in huge quantities, and they harvested the male flowers, which don't produce fruit anyway, to eat as a vegetable. For 1 cacao bean, you could buy a generous bundle of fresh squash blossoms from a vegetable vendor, but the real value was in buying them already prepared from a street food vendor. They would stuff the blossoms with cheese or beans, dip them in a light batter, and fry them until they were crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. Or they would sauté them with onions, tomatoes, and chilies to create a filling for tacos or a topping for tortillas. The flavor of squash blossoms is delicate, slightly sweet, with a subtle squash flavor, and the texture is soft and almost creamy when cooked. Squash blossom quesadillas were hugely popular. The vendor would take a fresh tortilla, fold it in half with squash blossoms and cheese inside, and cook it on the comal until the cheese melted and the tortilla was crispy. 1 or 2 cacao beans would buy you one of these, and it was a complete meal. The combination of the corn tortilla, the creamy cheese, and the delicate flavor of the blossoms was perfect. What about drinks besides Atole? Well, 1 cacao bean could buy you a cup of something called Chia fresca, which is seeing a revival today as a health drink. The Aztecs soaked chia seeds in water with lime juice and a touch of sweetener, creating a refreshing drink where the seeds formed a gel around themselves. It looked a bit strange, almost like frog eggs in water, but it tasted great and was incredibly hydrating. The chia seeds were packed with omega-3 fatty acids, protein, and fiber, making this simple drink a nutritional powerhouse. There was also pulque, the fermented drink made from agave sap. Now, pulque was more expensive than most street food because of the labor involved in making it, but you could buy a small cup for 2 or 3 cacao beans. Pulque was milky white, slightly thick, and had a flavor that's hard to describe to anyone who hasn't tried it. It was slightly sour, slightly yeasty, with a complex flavor that came from the fermentation process. The alcohol content was relatively low, maybe equivalent to a weak beer, so it was consumed throughout the day by working people. The pulque vendors had special containers made from gourds or pottery, and they would pour the pulque into cups made from the same materials. The drink was still fermenting and would continue to change flavor as the day went on, so enthusiasts knew exactly what time of day to buy from their favorite vendor to get the flavor profile they preferred. Early morning pulque was less sour and more sweet. Afternoon pulque was more complex and funky. Evening pulque was at its most fermented and had the strongest flavor. Now, here's something that might surprise you about the economics of Aztec street food. The prices were remarkably stable. One cacao bean consistently bought you roughly the same amount of food year after year, decade after decade. This was because the Aztec Empire had sophisticated economic regulations and market inspectors who went around ensuring that vendors weren't price gouging or shortchanging customers. If a vendor was caught cheating, they could be banned from the market or even face more serious punishment. The market inspectors also ensured quality. Food that was spoiled or contaminated was confiscated, and the vendor was punished. This meant that even the cheapest street food was generally safe to eat, which is more than you could say for many markets in Europe at the same time. The Aztecs understood that public health was tied to food safety, and they had regulations in place centuries before European cities figured this out. Let's talk about eggs, specifically turkey eggs and duck eggs. The Aztecs domesticated turkeys, and turkey eggs were available in the markets, though they were more expensive than plant-based foods. For 2 or 3 cacao beans, you could buy a couple of turkey eggs from a vendor who would cook them to order. The most popular preparation was similar to scrambled eggs, but mixed with tomatoes, onions, and chilies, creating a dish that's still popular in Mexico today, called huevos a la mexicana. Duck eggs were harvested from the wild ducks that lived on the lakes, and they were considered a delicacy. They're richer than chicken eggs, with larger yolks and a more intense flavor. Duck eggs cost more, maybe 4 or 5 cacao beans each, but they were worth it for special occasions. Vendors would hard boil them and serve them with salt and chili powder, or they would fry them and serve them on tortillas with salsa. What about mushrooms? The forests and mountains around the Valley of Mexico were full of edible mushrooms, and the Aztecs were expert foragers who knew which ones were delicious and which ones were dangerous. Street vendors sold mushrooms that had been gathered that morning, either fresh or already prepared in various ways. For 1 or 2 cacao beans, you could buy a serving of mushrooms cooked with epazote and chilies, wrapped in a tortilla. The most common edible mushrooms were similar to what we'd call field mushrooms today, but there were also more exotic varieties. Some mushrooms were considered sacred and were used only in religious ceremonies, but plenty of regular culinary mushrooms were available to everyone. Mushroom soup was especially popular during the rainy season when mushrooms were most abundant. Vendors would make big pots of broth with mushrooms, herbs, and chilies, serving it in clay bowls for a cacao bean or 2. The soup was warming, filling, and had that deep umami flavor that mushrooms provide. With a couple of tortillas on the side, it was a complete meal. Now, let's talk about something that most people don't associate with Aztec food, but was actually quite common. Rabbit. The Aztecs hunted wild rabbits in the countryside, and rabbit meat was relatively affordable. For 3 or 4 cacao beans, you could buy rabbit that had been stewed with chilies and tomatoes, served over tortillas or in a tamal. Rabbit was leaner than the waterfowl that rich people ate, and it had a mild, slightly gamey flavor that went well with strong seasonings. The vendors who specialized in rabbit usually bought whole rabbits from hunters, then butchered and cooked them in their stalls. The smell of rabbit stew was distinctive, and customers would seek out their favorite vendors based on their specific preparation methods. Some vendors made rabbit in a green sauce made from pumpkin seeds and tomatillos. Others made it in a red sauce with dried chilies and tomatoes. Some vendors would add cactus paddles, called nopales, which had a texture similar to okra and a slightly tart flavor that complemented the meat. Every vendor had their specialty, and market regulars knew exactly which stall to visit for their preferred style of rabbit. Let's talk about something that sounds exotic, but was actually quite common. Ant eggs. Remember the Eskimos we mentioned earlier? These weren't just a weird novelty food. They were a regular part of the diet, especially during the season when they were available. The eggs were harvested from underground ant nests, usually from a species of large black ant that built nests near agave plants. Harvesting Eskimos was dangerous work because the ants would defend their nests aggressively. The harvesters would dig up the nests and extract the white eggs while being bitten repeatedly. But the reward was worth it because Eskimos sold for good prices and were considered delicious. For 2 or 3 cacao beans, a vendor would give you a small serving of Eskimos sautéed with butter or oil, chilies, and herbs. The texture of Eskimos is unique, slightly crunchy on the outside, but creamy inside, and the flavor is nutty and rich. They're incredibly high in protein and fat, making them very satisfying. They were usually served in tacos or with tortillas on the side, and they were popular with all social classes. Even nobles ate Eskimos, though they might have them prepared more elaborately at home. What about something sweet and refreshing on a hot day? For 1 cacao bean, you could buy a cup of fresh fruit juice. The vendors had special clay juicers that they used to extract juice from various fruits. There was orange juice, though the oranges were different from modern ones, smaller and sometimes more sour. There was juice from various tropical fruits that grew in the warmer lowlands and were brought to the market by traders. One particularly popular drink was made from the fruit of the prickly pear cactus. These bright pink or red fruits, called tunas in Nahuatl, produced a juice that was sweet, refreshing, and had a unique flavor that's hard to describe if you've never tried it. The juice was sometimes mixed with water and a bit of sweetener to make it go further, but even diluted it was delicious and full of vitamins. There was also juice made from mame sapote, a fruit with bright orange flesh that tastes like a mixture of sweet potato, chocolate, and honey. This juice was thicker and richer than most fruit juices, almost like a smoothie, and it was filling enough to count as a meal replacement. 1 cup might cost 2 cacao beans because the fruit itself was more expensive, but it was worth it for the incredible flavor. Here's something that would only cost you 1 cacao bean and would be completely satisfying: tlacoyo. These were thick oval cakes made from masa, stuffed with beans or fava beans, and cooked on a comal until they developed a crispy exterior. They were like thick, stuffed tortillas, and they were hugely popular as quick, filling street food. The vendor would have pre-made the tlacoyos earlier in the day, stuffing them with seasoned beans and shaping them into their distinctive oval shape. When you ordered one, they would heat it on the comal until it was hot all the way through and slightly crispy on the outside. Then they'd top it with salsa, maybe some crumbled cheese if you paid extra, and some chopped onion and cilantro. The whole thing cost 1 cacao bean, maybe 2 if you wanted premium toppings, and it would keep you full for hours. The beauty of tlacoyos was their versatility. The basic bean-stuffed version was cheap and accessible to everyone, but vendors could stuff them with more expensive ingredients for customers who wanted to splurge. There were tlacoyos stuffed with fava beans, with mushrooms, with cheese, with chicharron, fried pork skin, though this was rare in Aztec times, or with various combinations of ingredients. Each type had its fans, and people would debate passionately about which filling was the best. What if you wanted something more substantial, an actual meal rather than a snack? For 5 or 6 cacao beans, you could buy a complete meal from a vendor who specialized in larger portions. This might include a large serving of beans, several tortillas, a portion of mole, or another sauce, some grilled nopales, cactus paddles, and maybe some fresh vegetables on the side. The nopales themselves deserve special mention because they were an important part of the Aztec diet, and they were incredibly cheap. For half a cacao bean or trading some other small item, you could buy several cactus paddles. The vendor would scrape off the spines, cut the paddles into strips, and grill them over hot coals. The grilled nopals had a texture similar to green beans, but with a slight sliminess, which goes away if you cook them right, and a tart, fresh flavor. Nopales were often mixed with eggs or added to tacos. They were cooked in soups and stews. They were eaten fresh in salads. They were so versatile and nutritious that they were basically a staple food, as important as squash or tomatoes, and they were nearly free if you lived anywhere near where they grew wild, which was almost everywhere in the region. Let's talk about something that might cost a bit more, but was still affordable for an occasional treat. Roasted agave hearts. The agave plant was incredibly important to Aztec culture. It provided fiber for ropes and cloth, sap for pulque, and the heart of the plant could be roasted and eaten. Vendors would have agave hearts that had been slow roasted in underground pits for hours until they were sweet and tender. The roasted agave tasted something like a cross between an artichoke heart and caramelized pineapple. It was fibrous, but in a pleasant way, and the flavor was complex with notes of caramel, vanilla, and earthiness. A portion of roasted agave cost maybe 3 or 4 cacao beans, and it was substantial enough to be a meal on its own. People would eat it with their hands, pulling apart the fibrous flesh and chewing on it to extract the sweet juice and tender bits. The same roasted agave was also mashed and formed into cakes that could be stored for long periods. These cakes were easier to transport and trade, and they were reconstituted with water to make a sweet porridge or added to other dishes for sweetness and nutrition. Agave in its various forms was so important that it was almost like having multiple different foods from one plant. Now, what about street food that was specifically for celebrations or special days? During festival days, the markets would overflow with special foods that weren't available the rest of the time. But even these festival foods were relatively affordable. For 3 or 4 cacao beans, you could buy a serving of tamales made with special ingredients, wrapped in banana leaves and stuffed with elaborate fillings that included spices and ingredients that had been traded from far away. There were also special breads made from amaranth flour, shaped into figures representing gods or animals, and baked until crispy. These breads were often sweetened with honey or agave syrup and flavored with anise or other spices. They weren't just food, they were part of the religious observance, but they were also delicious, and people looked forward to them all year. During certain festivals, there were special drinks made from cacao, but different from the usual hot chocolate that nobles drank. These festival drinks might include more spices, different types of chilies, or flowers that added color and flavor. They were served in special cups and were part of the communal celebration. While regular cacao drinks were expensive, these festival versions were sometimes subsidized or sold at lower prices so that everyone could participate in the celebration. Think about this for a moment. What would your equivalent of one cacao bean buy you today? The economic historians have done calculations, and one cacao bean was roughly equivalent to having somewhere between 50 cents and $1 in purchasing power, depending on the specific item and the time period. That means that for less than $1, you could buy a complete, nutritious meal made from fresh ingredients by an expert who had been perfecting their craft for years. Compare that to modern street food. Even in countries where street food is cheap, you'd be hard-pressed to find something as nutritious and well-prepared as what Aztec vendors offered for one cacao bean. And the variety. You could eat street food in Tenochtitlan every day for months without repeating the same meal. There were vendors who specialized in morning foods, afternoon snacks, and evening meals. There were vendors for every taste preference, every dietary need, and every budget level. The street food culture of the Aztecs was so sophisticated that it supported thousands of full-time vendors who made their living entirely from selling food in the markets. These weren't people who sold food on the side while doing other work. This was their career, their profession, and many vendors built successful businesses that they passed down to their children. The best vendors had regular customers who would seek them out specifically, walking past dozens of other vendors to buy from their favorite. So, here's a question for you. If you could go back in time and visit the Tenochtitlan market with a handful of cacao beans in your pocket, what would you try first? Would you go for the safe and familiar, like bean tacos or tamales? Or would you be adventurous and try the algae cakes, the insect dishes, or the exotic fruits you've never heard of? What flavors and textures from this ancient culture would you want to experience? The tragedy is that so much of this food culture was destroyed or dramatically changed after the Spanish conquest. Many of the ingredients that were common in Aztec markets are now rare or extinct. The sophisticated balance of flavors and nutrients that the Aztecs achieved through centuries of agricultural and culinary development was disrupted. Many of the traditional preparation methods were lost as Spanish cooking techniques were imposed on the indigenous population. But not everything was lost. Modern Mexican street food is the direct descendant of what we've been talking about. When you buy a taco from a street vendor in Mexico City today, you're participating in a food culture that goes back centuries. Many of the dishes we've discussed are still made, though sometimes with different ingredients or slightly modified techniques. The tamales, the tortillas, the salsas, the atole, all of these are still part of daily life in Mexico. In fact, there's been a revival of interest in pre-Hispanic cuisine in recent years. Chefs and food historians are researching ancient codices and archaeological findings to recreate Aztec dishes as authentically as possible. Restaurants in Mexico City now serve pre-Hispanic tasting menus where you can try food made with native ingredients prepared in traditional ways. Some vendors and markets still make things like Eskimos and grasshoppers, though they're now marketed as exotic delicacies rather than everyday food. The floating gardens, the chinampas that provided so many of the vegetables and herbs we've talked about, still exist in Xochimilco on the outskirts of Mexico City. They're now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and farmers there still grow produce using techniques that date back to Aztec times. You can visit these floating gardens, see the crops growing, and buy vegetables that are the direct descendants of what Aztec vendors sold in their markets. The economic system based on cacao beans didn't survive the conquest. The Spanish introduced metal coins and disrupted the trade networks that made cacao available. But cacao itself became one of Mexico's most important exports, and chocolate made from Mexican cacao beans became famous around the world. Every time you eat chocolate, you're consuming something that the Aztecs considered so valuable, they used it as money. The story of Aztec street food is ultimately a story about human ingenuity and cultural achievement. The Aztecs took the plants and animals available to them in their environment and created a food culture that was nutritionally sound, ecologically sustainable, and absolutely delicious. They didn't have metal tools or the wheel or draft animals, but they had deep knowledge of agriculture, sophisticated techniques for processing and preserving food, and a cultural appreciation for flavor and nutrition that rivaled any civilization in history. When Spanish conquistadors first arrived in Tenochtitlan, they were stunned by what they saw. The city was larger and cleaner than any European city of the time. The markets were more organized and better stocked. The food was more diverse and more flavorful. One conquistador wrote that he had seen the markets of Constantinople and Rome and many other great cities, but he had never seen anything to compare with Tlatelolco. The variety of goods, the orderliness of the vendors, the quality of the products, all of it impressed these hardened soldiers who had seen much of the world. And at the center of this impressive market system was the humble street food vendor, the person who woke up before dawn to prepare their mesa or collect their fresh ingredients, who stood over hot fires all day cooking for a stream of customers, who took pride in their work and built their reputation meal by meal. These vendors were the backbone of the economy, feeding the workers who built the temples, the craftspeople who made the tools, the traders who brought goods from far away, and the common people who made the empire function. The fact that nutritious, delicious food was available to everyone, rich or poor, for just a few cacao beans tells us something profound about Aztec society. This wasn't a civilization where the poor starved while the rich feasted. This was a society that valued food so highly that they made sure everyone had access to it. The street food vendors weren't at the bottom of the social hierarchy. They were respected members of the community providing an essential service. What would the Aztecs think if they could see modern street food culture? They would probably recognize the basic concept immediately. The idea of specialized vendors selling specific types of food in a market setting, the communal aspect of eating while standing or sitting in a busy public space, the economic accessibility of street food compared to fancy restaurants, all of these concepts would be familiar to them. They might be amazed by our tools and techniques, by the metal pots and gas burners and refrigeration, but the fundamental idea of street food would make perfect sense. They might be disappointed by how limited our flavor palettes have become. The Aztecs routinely combined sweet, salty, sour, spicy, and bitter in single dishes, creating complex flavor profiles that many modern eaters find challenging. They might wonder why we don't eat more insects when they're such an efficient source of protein. They might be puzzled by our squeamishness about algae, or our unfamiliarity with dozens of edible plants that they considered common ingredients. But they would probably be pleased to know that their food culture survived, even if in modified form. Tacos and tamales are now famous around the world. Chocolate is one of the most beloved flavors on the planet. Avocados, tomatoes, chili peppers, vanilla, all of these ingredients that were first cultivated and popularized by the Aztecs are now essential components of global cuisine. In a very real sense, the Aztec street food vendors won. Their food culture conquered the world more thoroughly than their empire ever could have. The next time you bite into a taco, or enjoy a chocolate bar, or add chili powder to your food, take a moment to think about the centuries of knowledge and tradition that went into developing those flavors. Think about the Aztec vendor standing over a hot comal in the Tlatelolco market 500 years ago, patting out tortillas and serving them to hungry customers for a single cacao bean. Think about the sophisticated agricultural systems, the deep understanding of nutrition, and the cultural values that made such an incredible food culture possible. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone tells you that street food is low class, or that ancient civilizations had boring food, you can tell them about the Aztecs. You can tell them about the dozens of varieties of tamales, the complex salsas, the nutritious algae cakes, the roasted grasshoppers, and all the other incredible things you could buy for one cacao bean in the greatest market in the Americas. You can tell them that 500 years ago, common people in Tenochtitlan were eating better than nobles in Europe, that food culture isn't about expensive ingredients or fancy presentations. It's about knowledge, technique, and respect for the ingredients you have. The legacy of Aztec street food lives on every time someone grinds corn for tortillas, every time someone wraps a filling in a corn husk to make a tamal, every time someone combines chocolate with chilies to make mole. These techniques and flavor combinations didn't emerge randomly. They were developed over centuries by countless cooks and vendors, each one contributing their knowledge and skill to a collective culinary tradition. And the fact that you could access all of this for just a few cacao beans, that it was democratic and available to everyone, that might be the most impressive achievement of all. If you enjoyed learning about this incredible food culture, if you're amazed by what the Aztecs accomplished with their street food vendors and cacao bean economy, then do me a favor. If you enjoy these historical videos, please like the video, subscribe to History Candle YouTube channel. There are so many more stories from history that deserve to be told. So many fascinating cultures and achievements that have been forgotten or overlooked. The Aztecs were just one civilization among many that achieved remarkable things, and their story is worth remembering, not just for the temples and pyramids, but for the everyday life of regular people buying lunch in a market with a handful of cacao beans.